Here's what Weinberg had to say about religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done. It may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. Really, our greatest contribution. And so Dawkins, in his most recent book, Irrational or Not, it does unfortunately seem plausible that if somebody sincerely believes God is watching his every move, he might be more likely to be good. So Dawkins now thinks that Christians are actually good. Is Christianity good for the world? Is Christianity good for civilization? I'm so glad to be here with you guys tonight. Yeah, my family says that I come from healthy stock, and so I left most of my children and my wife's home in Utah tonight. Kidding. But I did have one of my ancestors had 5 wives and 36 children, of which I'm a descendant. And so kind of an interesting background with that. The highest level splinter group of Mormonism ever, and the highest defection actually involved my family. So that's how I kind of got interested when I became a Christian in the traditional sense, how I got interested in philosophy and comparative religions, because I started asking questions about Mormonism and wondering about the Book of Mormon, not just for the sake of tradition, but for the sake of truth, and rereading it and having big questions and wondering about the Bible, and having learned that it was full of holes growing up. It never mattered though, because we had a living prophet. But now I no longer believed in a living prophet, and so I had to ask at that point, what about the Bible, and what about God's existence, and if so, which God? And that sent me into a period of skepticism, and then ended up running into this area of apologetics when I was studying philosophy and comparative religions, and then ended up being a professor, teaching it for a dozen years at IU before coming here. And so yes, I have written several books with various scholars who were, like me, former Mormon, BYU professor and others, physicists out there in Utah. Written 2 books in academic philosophy, one on Aquinas, Maimonides, and Aristotle, and that was the subject of my dissertation on the good life, and then another one based on a debate that I moderated at Purdue University, and we assembled a team of atheist and Christian philosophers, physicists, and rhetoricians to contribute to the book. In fact, the physicist, who was the Christian, was Robert Kaida, who used to be the plasma physicist here for about 40 years. So you might be interested in his chapter. But Christianity, good or bad for the world? When I was moderating that debate, I was trying to find William Lane Craig, an opponent that he would find interest in. I did talk with Peter Singer here at Princeton. He was willing to do it, but he wanted to charge $25,000. And then I would have had to pay the opponent $25,000. And I thought, I just don't have that kind of money. But I began on a list of the top 50 atheists in the country. I was talking with people like Leonard Mlodinow, who has co-authored the last 2 or 3 books with Stephen Hawking before he passed away. He originally said yes, and then he found out who the opponent was, and he declined. I was talking with Leonard Susskind from Stanford University, one of the founders of string theory. He declined. I ended up with number 14 on the list, Duke University's department head, Alex Rosenberg. But along the way, I spoke with Steven Weinberg, who has recently passed away also, and he was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And here's what Weinberg had to say about religion. He said, the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and in fact, it may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. Really, our greatest contribution. A Nobel Prize winning physicist. You would think it would be something in science, something maybe in physics. I just had an opportunity to go into the classroom where Einstein taught. That was so exciting, so surreal just to be there, right? You would think something in physics, but no. Eradicate all religion. Religion poisons everything. Religion is just that bad. So regardless of one's evaluation of the question, Christianity good or bad for the world, the greatest mark in history, in any movement in history, religious or secular, seems to be the imprint of Jesus. So earning a PhD and speaking 8 languages by the age of 22. You know, how many do you speak? 8 languages by the age of 22. Yale historian Jaroslav Pelikan minced no words in his book when he said, regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. If it were possible, with some sort of super magnet, to pull up out of that history every scrap of metal bearing at least a trace of his name, how much would be left? Indeed. And so you have someone as notable today as Harvard's famous psychology, Steven Pinker, in his book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And I write to the side what is on the top of the book, a comment by Bill Gates, my new favorite book of all time. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today is going to be responding to things in Pinker's tome here. Now note what this is. If you said you understand what apologetics is, well, what kind of apologetics? We don't mean apologizing, of course. We mean giving a rational defense. Everyone who defends a dissertation is doing apologetics for that particular topic. But when you're talking about the field of, say, theism or philosophy of religion, there is theistic apologetics, and that's what Ratio Christi does, but there is also atheological apologetics. And that's what Pinker is doing here. Look at the subtitle, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. He is calling for the Enlightenment to come back, for the resurrection of the Enlightenment. The volume is an apologetic. It's a defense for secular humanism, and not necessarily for science, but for scientism, for that which made the world good. Yet it seems to offer somewhat of a revisionary history, perhaps, compared to what Jaroslav Pelikan, an actual historian from Yale, has to say on the matter. Pinker's message is that reason, science, and humanism, all good things, which he claims to be the keys of the Enlightenment, have led to mass progress in life and in human development. And he's right. They have, no doubt. And he asserts that they are our best means to continue the progress into the future. But he's concerned. He doesn't think that they are being consistently upheld today, and that we need to fortify against their 2 primary enemies today: religion on the one hand, and socialism or Marxism on the other hand. So it kind of positions Steven Pinker where you think he might be in that spectrum of ideas that are involved in Western culture right now, or broader culture in the field of ideas. Now, the goodness or the badness is not our primary concern. We don't want to believe something merely because it's good or because it's useful, but we should not believe it for that reason. But it's certainly relevant, especially in an age where Christianity's chief critics today are claiming that Christianity is not only false, but that it's harmful, that it's hateful, that it's not just hideously headless, but that it's oppressive. And so this comes back all the way almost to the 1st century when Justin Martyr was martyred for his belief, and he wrote 2 apologies, not I'm sorry's, but apologetics, defenses, one to the Roman Senate and the other to the Roman Emperor. The charge was that Christians are insurrectionists. They are bad citizens. They're not good. And he said, look, no, Christians can be the best citizens. We may not be able to concede to what you want, namely that we proclaim Caesar to be Kurios or Lord, but we can be the best of citizens. We can answer the question Plato asked, why should I be moral? Why should I be a moral citizen, a good citizen? And that is because we believe, according to our scriptures, that we are operating under God and that we should obey authority so long as that authority does not forbid us to do that which God requires or require us to do that which God forbids. And so other than Kurios, we can be the best of citizens even when the Roman centurions are not around. And so showing Christianity's net good creates a plausibility structure for its veracity, especially when the reasons for its goodness connect so deeply and intimately to its truth claims. Now, to be sure, at the outset, Christianity, or at least Christians, have been guilty of much harm and evil in the past. No one can deny that. We can't ignore that. But we also, to be honest with ourselves, must disentangle practicing Christians from merely professing Christians, right? We talk about the big H word. Don't use the H word. Hypocrisy. Not practicing what you preach. There's a disconnect there. Just because someone claims to be a Christian, and if they're out raping people and murdering people and maiming people all the time, they're probably not a Christian. Why? Because Webster's dictionary does not define what a Christian is. Jesus does. And he said, you shall know them by their fruits. You can see a Christ follower. You don't need to read Webster's dictionary for that one. You also need to disentangle in even practicing Christians from their Christ. Because no real, genuine practicing Christian is claiming that Christians are perfect, that they perfectly align with what their own beliefs are. In fact, it's just the opposite. They claim that the reason they need a Savior is because they cannot live up to the ideals of what their teacher puts forward. And so that is, in the Christian message, the purpose for why Christ had to come. And we'll get into St. Anselm, the philosophical theologian, a little bit later. But we couldn't do what was required for us to do. So no one is good enough. But with that, having said that, if you want to demolish Christianity, you need to really throw mud on Christ, not on just practicing Christians or even merely professing Christians. Now, for tonight, the existential question about God is usually what we think of when we're in philosophy of religion, arguing back and forth for God's existence, usually in apologetics, whether God exists. The axiological question, by contrast, isn't asking whether God necessarily exists, but whether God's existence would bring added value to the world. And so you have two distinct responses here. You have the protheism and the anti-theistic responses. The protheism position naturally says that yes, God's existence does or would bring added value to the world. The anti-theistic position, by contrast, says that God's existence would not. In fact, it would detract from the added value of the world. In fact, like I think a Christopher Hitchens book, Religion Poisons Everything. Religion's bad. That was the position of Stephen Meyer, not Stephen Meyer, the Discovery Institute, the Nobel Prize winner that we discussed earlier. Because why not something in physics? Because that's not good enough. The best thing we can do is eradicate religion, because all religion, but including Christian religion, is just that bad. And so one way of approaching this question then from a protheistic position is to look out there and locate goods or values that don't necessarily have consensus, because nothing has consensus in life. If you're looking for that, just keep moving, because we don't have it in anything, virtually anything. What you're looking for, however, is what many people largely come to believe. Aristotle would call these generally accepted opinions and begin his dialectic from there. Things that most people simply will not, and for good reason, deny that are goods for human flourishing or something like that. And so, you could take the stance that those goods that we locate entail God's existence. That is, you couldn't have these goods without God existing. That would be a robust way to do it. A more modest way is to say not that they entail God's existence, but that they make God's existence more likely. That's the more modest approach. It tends to draw a broader audience who's more likely to consider the plausibility, which then could lead to the veracity of Christianity. And that's the endeavor here tonight. So the argument isn't that some of the goods couldn't emerge aside from Christianity, but they in fact did not, and there are good reasons for that. I think most in the West simply fail to appreciate their heritage. Secular humanists like Steven Pinker point to the various goods that made the West great or made the West best. And at that point, I would concur with that expression. I used to be a little bit shy, probably for social reasons, but I don't believe I am anymore. If the West wasn't best in certain robust ways, you wouldn't have millions of people literally trying to break into Western nations despite the problems of those Western nations and even despite America and its problems. You wouldn't have millions of people trying to break in if it wasn't at least better, if not best. There are certain things about it, even with all of its freckles and warts and problems, that are magnetizing, that seem to be good enough to risk your life to get into. But humanists like Pinker point out that these great goods were due to the Enlightenment. But that I think in this case, we can look at evidence, we can look at data, and evidence and data are one thing, and we all have access to the same evidence and data, but that's not the same thing as explanation or interpretation or modeling, right? The inference to the best explanation is something else. Such people like Pinker are, in essence, I think, living on the borrowed capital of a Christian worldview, just like Pinker is exactly doing while he waxes eloquent from the first university in the New World, Harvard. He can sit there and literally saw off the branches of the trees that he's sitting on there. And so we're going to consider some widely affirmed values or goods whose most prominent manifestations, I think, are best explained by Christianity. So we get to the question. Pilate asked the question in the New Testament famously, what is truth? We want to ask the question, what is good? And once again, some of the greatest objections today to Christianity aren't concerning the existential question, does God exist or is it true? They don't believe that it's good. They, in fact, think that it's harmful, that it's hateful, that it's oppressive and so forth. And that's why a question like this is relevant. Is Christianity good for the world? And we're not talking about just the next world, if such a world exists. That was one of Marx's big objections, is that Christians are so heavenly minded that they are essentially of no earthly good. We're concerned with right now. Is Christianity good for the world right now? Is Christianity good for civilization? Now, when we think about the word good, we often think about it as an exclusively ethical notion, but it's not. We're thinking about a metaphysical good. We're thinking that it's broader than ethics. Take, for example, Aristotle's favorite illustration, human health. Human health is not something that is subjective or relative to individual opinions or groupthink or majority report or anything like that. Human health is objective. To say that something is objective means that it's true for all people at all times and all places. Not that it's subjective, that it's personal preferences or relative to individuals or to groups. Health is like that. When you look at a healthy person, we're not talking about what is normal by statistical average. Most people might eat Doritos, drink Coke, eat pizza, have a Super Bowl party every day, and then they just get beer belly. They don't get babe. And I mean that by, the Super Bowl commercials. You always get these, hunk guys, the big muscles, and they're drinking beer, right? And then they have all these gorgeous women coming by that are tan, and they look great, and the guys and the gals, they all look great. And so the commercial's supposed to say, if you drink beer, you get babes. I drink beer, but I don't get babes. Something's wrong with the problem, with the logic here. I drink beer and I only get beer belly. Something else there. A statistical average is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about what is normal, but what is normative. Oughtness, right? Oughtness. There is, when it comes to human health, a certain normativity there. Even if it's the vast minority, you can tell, you can just by naked observation, Aristotle there with his toga, eating his grapes, looking out there, and he can see specimens of good and bad health. Human health is objective. It's not subjective. And now when we're going to be talking about good, we're going to be thinking the same thing. But what we want to do also is to distinguish, as philosophers do, you want to distinguish various goods on things that are good to me versus things that are good for me. The former is an example of something that is subjective. It's preferential, right? The latter is something that is not subjective. It's objective. And so, you know, growing up, you probably fought your parents on this. I know I fought my kids on this constantly. You know, eat your broccoli. No, eat your broccoli. Why? Because it's good for you. No, it's yucky. It's not good to me. I want my cotton candy. The cotton candy is good to me. No, cotton candy is just good to you. Broccoli is good for you. And my job as a parent is trying to, you know, create their palate in a way that their desires align with what is desirable. Their subjective, preferential desires line up with what is objectively desirable for good health and human flourishing. And in this way, belief is to reality for the sake of truth what desire is to desirable for the sake of goodness. And when it comes to you know, truth and goodness, being and goodness are identical for philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. They're just approached from different aspects, right? Being philosophically implies that all things, that everything has an end or a goal toward which it is directed for that thing's flourishing, for its maturity, for it living the good life according to what kind of a life that thing is. The life of a plant requires photosynthesis. It requires good soil and water, nutrition, right? And you take something as mundane as, say, an acorn. And an acorn, if it is given the right conditions, again, sunlight, water, nutrition, soil, it's going to grow up every time to be a pizza, right? No. To be a dog? No. To be an evergreen tree? No. To be an oak tree every single time. And this notion of teleology, for example, or end-directedness, is not dead today. It's still alive and well, including in fields like biology, where we speak of the form and function of a heart, and we ask, what's the purpose of a heart? To pump blood, right? And so this is another thing that we can get into later, but let's move on then and look at Jesus, prosperity, and the responsibility of persons and societies. And so we can look at not just individual things, but we can look at entire systems that are helpful to human flourishing, that are desirable in an objective sense for human good, whereas ones that detract from it simply are not. While absent in the minds of many, Jesus impacted economics before it was ever a thing. And so you get, you know, someone like Pinker who endorses the capitalist or free market enterprise. Of course, we know that capitalism, from where Marx first defined it in Das Kapital, has changed an awful lot too, right? I mean, the owners of the businesses today, of the corporations, are the workers. You ever hear of a 401k? And so it's not just you have the capitalist up here and the workers of the world, and we need the workers of the world to unite and throw off the bourgeoisie, the evil oppressors. No, let's use the term free market economics. Pinker endorses free market enterprise as a means of the greatest prosperity as a civilizational good, an objective civilizational good. And he shows how the free market system has lifted man from abject poverty across the world. And he mentions in this process Adam Smith. Now, if you've never, there's some students in here who are economics majors. Have you ever read The Wealth of Nations? Yeah, just one? Oh my goodness! If this is a science, if there is a science to economics, and that's what the claim is, that book is surely one of them. It is so boring. You have to listen to it on Audible just to get through it, right? But when you think of Adam Smith, he was a moral philosopher. He was roommates for a while with David Hume, the father of modern skepticism, another moral philosopher, right? Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, that's how we express it, but the whole title of the book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We're not just talking about correlation, we're talking about causation. And the book was published in 1776. We were having a little skirmish at the time. I think we have someone in here, Elijah. We had to beat you guys into submission, right? On 4th of July, we say, hope you're enjoying work today. We have it off. But Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. He spoke of the invisible hand of God. Without Big Brother coming along and providing so many regulations, you have consumers and producers who have this free exchange, a product and a consumer who values that product, and they get together and they come up with a price that they both seem to think is reasonably fair enough for them to swap and walk away with the artifact, the currency, and the product, and they walk the other direction and think they both got an adequate deal without any big government. And this idea, as rudimentary as that illustration of it is, came over. We were having a skirmish at the time. You had to give it a little while for things to calm down. Alexander Hamilton, others rush in. America was small enough at the time. It was nimble enough. We applied this new economic system. And suddenly, before long, America would become the most prosperous nation in human history, and that would never change. To the point where other countries wanted to start doing it too. To the point where even like communist China, by government, wants to apply some kind of quasi-free market system in economics because they find it as a way of making wealth. It's like Aristotle looking out there and by observation understanding human health. Adam Smith was doing something like that with respect to economics. Now, Pinker likes to credit this to secularism, but his Harvard colleague down the hall in his recent book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Benjamin Friedman disagrees with his Harvard colleague, Steven Pinker, and he defends the vital role of Christianity in the birth of capitalism, even if in the contemporary scene has long since divorced itself from its origin. The contemporary scene, we might say, is living on the borrowed capital of a Christian worldview, even if it doesn't admit to that being the case. Pinker demurs concerning Marxism as a system for social good, and I'm apt to agree. Granted, that's going to be disputed by Marxists, but in terms of bringing people out of abject poverty, it's just a fact. When the dictatorship of the proletariat emerges, the workers of the world are supposed to unite, but someone's got to lead them, Lenin said, right? And so when the dictatorship of the proletariat emerges, some leaders have to dictate for just a little while, and of course then the state will just fade away according to the Leninists, but the anarchists say no, we're going to have to make it go away too. But either way, these dictators, they're just going to give it all back, like they all do, like Kim Jong-il did, and like Mao, and like Pol Pot, and like Hugo Chavez, and like every one of them. They're not living in the tents of squalor of the people whom they allegedly liberated. They're living high on the hog in their palaces, and they're not about to give it up. Well, communism's never really been tried, we're told. And that no Scotsman fallacy will be applied every single time. But notably, no Marxist leader ever took his own poison. And in fact, they killed over 100 million of their own citizens. Pretty bad record. Far from Marxism's socialistic impetus of non-charitable, coercive, statist redistribution from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Some people say that Marxism is a sort of a pseudo-Christian cult, oftentimes invoking passages from the book of Acts, showing that the early Christians, they were socialist as well, or Jesus was a socialist. Now, I think the early church followed down through history Jesus modeled by giving voluntarily, not involuntary redistribution, and Christians followed. They gave to the poor via voluntary charity. Marx, despite his Judeo-Christian heritage, did not follow. Despite his mother being a practicing Jew, an observant Jew, despite his father being Jewish but converted to Lutheranism for business purposes, you might say that Jesus was the more faithful of the two if we wrote a book called The Tale of Two Jews, according to the principles of Judaism. Judaism taught that if a man doesn't work, that he shouldn't eat. The biblical world embraced private property. Otherwise, you wouldn't make sense of the command, thou shalt not steal. Private property was assumed in the biblical record. Marx, by contrast, says, I can summarize in the Communist Manifesto my view: abolish private property. We want the state to own everything. Now, capitalism, or the free market system, if we want to call it that, has had abuses, admittedly, in the Industrial Revolution, which began in the English world and was criticized by the likes of Marx. But proper use has revealed great fruit and even spawned many virtues from self-interest. Now, this goes back to Adam Smith when, to take us back to that slide, he talked about the invisible hand of God. And a famous line from that book was that it is not from the beneficence of the brewer, the butcher, or the baker that we get our food at night, but from self-interest. Now, he didn't say selfishness, self-interest. He recognized something about human nature, that humans have self-interest. That's important. It's not selfishness, and it's not the Buddhist notion of selflessness, which is metaphysically impossible unless there is no such thing as a self, the no-self doctrine that Buddhists embrace. But we come back to this then, this notion of the virtues of self-interest, and among these are innovation, our excellence, our hard work, our wealth accumulation, creativeness. You get rewarded according to your labor, and you're going to be motivated to get out there and do it more and start businesses and bless other people with work as well. And so you had someone like John Wesley who taught that you should earn as much as you can so you can save as much as you can so you can give as much as you can. And then the great sociologist Max Weber from Germany came over. He was a contemporary of Marx, and he observed the correlation between being Protestant and being involved in business, such that the notion took on a spiritual vocus in Latin, a spiritual calling for Protestants would now replace this vast dichotomy that came to be seen between the priest and the parishioner. If you wanted to serve God fully with your life, you didn't have to become a missionary or a priest. You could become a butcher, a brewer, a baker, a tent maker, a homemaker. Anything that wasn't intrinsically sinful now was going to have a spiritual characteristic. Like if we, had you considered tonight, whatever your major is, and suppose you were going to go into that field after you graduate here, that could be not a job, but a calling, not an occupation, but a vocation. And this early idea for these Protestant thinkers going back to the priesthood of all believers in their scriptural text, Revelation 1:6, and thinking about work, even before the proverbial fall of man in Genesis 3, work was not a product of the fall. Work was a blessing that was a kind of worship. Worship translated to worship. And so you could give God glory through your occupation, and each one of us could ask the question, if Jesus had as his mission in life, not to go to the cross, but instead to do your job or your job or your job, he could do it. How would he do it just a bit differently? It's revolutionary. If you subvert that notion of occupation into a vocation, that's what was happening. And that's why Weber wrote the book, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. That's what was happening there. And again, the Protestant Reformation was 1517. Remember, the Wealth of Nations wasn't until 1776. So all of this stuff is starting to come to fray here. He argued that this new attitude broke down the traditional economic system, paving the way for what the Wealth of Nations would eventually bring us with Adam Smith. So it doesn't really matter today whether Wall Street or Main Street want to admit it or even think about it. They're both living on the borrowed capital of a Christian worldview. Now, the common caricature of capitalistic greed doesn't necessarily apply when grounded in the Christian ethic of love and treating one's workers well. The biblical text says the worker is worth his wages. That greedy notion of the capitalist, that's a notion of someone who is not being a faithful Christian. A Christian capitalist will treat the workers well because the Christian capitalist believes that that person is made in God's image and is an equal and is valuable, has intrinsic dignity, and is worthy of their wages. But once capitalism emerged, the Protestant values were no longer necessary. Its ethos took upon a life of its own, and its history was divorced, and you have now what you have. Jesus, not secular humanism, I would contend, is the greatest motivator for charitable distribution of wealth in history. As a Jew, he embraced the sanctity of human life. A high view of humanity and provisional Christian humanism, whereby property ownership was a matter of stewardship. What I own is not my own. My money is not my own. I'm merely a manager, a steward of what is God's, and I need to ask God how I should use his wealth. He taught, he demonstrated the highest form of love, and Christianity, being the biggest movement, secular or religious in human history, have followers that follow, having substantial value impact on civilization. Hence, there is some kind of almost a predictability downstream. You will know them by their fruits. And so the compassionate Jesus community emerged very early on, and that fact is recognized by some of the most ardent atheistic thinkers, someone that I corresponded with. I've been at his office, but he's no longer here at Princeton. Peter Singer, retired. Gave his last lecture about 2 years ago, but here he is. The most famous moral philosopher alive, ironically, a Jewish atheist. Can you be a Jewish atheist? Yes, if one of the parts are sort of a facade and the other one real, right? You can't be an atheist theist. That's a contradiction. But you can still celebrate the holidays and so forth in that way. But Singer says this in his book, The Unsanctifying of Human Life. The doctrine of the sanctity of all human life and the seriousness with which the killing of any member of our species is regarded mark off the Christian ethical and cultural tradition from almost all others. That very many different societies have seen no moral objection to abortion or infanticide is, I think, well known. I mean, already you think about our culture and our views on life, preborn life, and even postborn life. He continues, even if we restrict our attention to infanticide, the list is almost endless. Both Plato in the Republic and Aristotle in his Politics proposed that the state command the killing of deformed infants. We find nothing resembling the doctrine that all lives of all born of human parents are sacred in the pre-Christian literature. There can be no doubt that the change in European attitudes to abortion and infanticide is a product of the coming of Christianity. That's not me, that's Peter Singer, the most infamous or moral philosopher alive. Nothing in the pre-Christian literature, he says. You go on, you have Yuval Noah Harari, part of the World Economic Forum, living in Israel. In his book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, a 1 million copy bestseller, and down at the bottom, Bill Gates has another comment, how much he loves this book. And what do we find Harari saying? According to the science of biology, people were not created. They have evolved, and they certainly did not evolve to be equal. Now you think about that word equality. This was part of the French Revolution. It was part of the American Revolution. But the French Revolution was a godless revolution. It sought to turn a 7-day week, which only comes from the Bible, into a 10-day week. So badly were they trying to reject God, the priests, the nobility, and the bourgeoisie, French terms, right? The proletariat. And Marx and Lenin looked on at the French Revolution and salivated. That was their ideal kind of revolution. And they talked about equality, fraternity, brotherhood. That's not the same equality we find in the Declaration of Independence. The idea, he says, of equality is inextricably intertwined with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul, and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it even mean that all people are equal? Evolution is based on differences. There are no such things as rights in biology. There is no such thing as liberty in biology. One of the contributing authors to my book by Routledge on Is Faith in God Reasonable? Debates in Philosophy, Science, and Rhetoric was Michael Roos. I invited John Hare from Yale to debate Michael Roos from Florida State at Purdue as well. We had an ex-porn star and an ex-sex slave come in and give their stories about slavery to freedom, and then they gave the gospel. And then Michael Roos and John Hare both got up on the stage to talk about, in light of the conference theme, human sex trafficking, whether one worldview or the other could better accommodate our intuitions about the objective evil of human sex trafficking, and which worldview has the best resources philosophically to combat human sex trafficking. And Michael Roos said this, in the Evolutionary Theory and Christian Ethics, he says, morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. He's written 40 books on Darwinism, 20 on philosophical and 20 on biological Darwinism. That's his take about it. That's his view as a sociobiological evolutionary ethicist. A little bit different than Peter Singer's, who is not just a utilitarian, but a preference utilitarian. And so we move on. Let's talk now about Christian humanism, as opposed to secular humanism, and organized charity. Interesting here. More impactful than secular humanism is Christian humanism in the world. When the abortion issue is brought up, it's common to hear critics of Christians, who are the most prominent defenders of the right to life for good reason, because they believe in the sanctity of human life, because there is a passage called Genesis 1:26 that says we're created in God's image, which Peter Singer, of course, rejects. They love to talk about how these pro-lifers are concerned only about preborn life, not about postborn or whole life. And so these critics' favorite scathing aphorism of pro-lifers is that, quote, life begins at conception and ends at birth, doesn't it? Don't you people care about the poor or the unwanted children? Why don't you go adopt children? Why don't you do something other than just be pro-lifers and picket an abortion clinic or something like that? But nothing could be further than the truth. There are somewhat 600 Planned Parenthoods around the nation that offer health services in addition to beheading, ripping off limbs, and burning babies alive, the elaborate methods used in common abortion, in these common women's health organizations. But there are over 3,000, 5 times as many, centers that offer genuine women's health and not a mixed bag with that of the Grim Reaper with medical care. They offer help to young mothers and their babies long after birth. Furthermore, churches come along and they help young mothers as well. Given the Christian impetus toward life and loving the poor, it is unsurprising that the Christian community is responsible for more than twice, if not 3 times that of the general population when it comes to adoption. So in fact, they are doing something, and more than something, for the postborn. And critics should consider the name of the hospital where they were born, or where they spent time during COVID, or where they might find their end of days. These hospitals, if you visited them, if you just looked at the name, the vast majority of them have a Christian denomination. You know, St. Luke, St. James, Ebenezer, Good Samaritan Hospital, a Lutheran hospital, Presbyterian hospital, you name it. There is no Bill Gates Hospital, Yuval Harari Hospital, Michael Roos Hospital. Why is that? It's because hospitals were invented largely and exponentially multiplied because of the prominence in the 4th century with the building of Basil's Hospital in the city of Caesarea in the Roman Empire. Basil the Great was a monastic leader, a theologian, and a church bishop, one who suffered sickness himself and envisioned and established the first hospital. A mere accident of history? I think not. I think there's something more essential to it than accidental, even though it is a fact of history. Followers follow. Today, inspired by Christ, the largest disaster relief organizations in the USA and with movements all around the world, like the American Red Cross, like the Salvation Army, like the Southern Baptist Convention. Not only were they founded by Christians, but they continue to be staffed predominantly by Christians and have given birth to global movements. They work in tandem. An example, every hot meal served by the Red Cross in the USA is prepared by the Southern Baptists. The largest child relief and adoption agencies are likewise Christian. The same goes for anti-sex trafficking organizations that help women not get trafficked and get back on the street. When I held our conference at Purdue on that topic, I did a lot of research on that. And then we took it on the road and we went to Berlin, Germany, took professors with us and taught over there on God and morality and joined anti-sex trafficking organizations. And you can see it, not only the founders, but predominantly the majority of people that are still there involved have that background of Christianity. America has become the most prosperous nation in the history of the world and is the economic mothership of world philanthropic giving across the globe. And notably, America is among the most heavily influenced by Christianity. Now, what about private charity? And what predictions can we make from a mere mentality someone has on this issue? Beyond institutions, when it comes to individual charitable giving, conservative Christians are the most charitable. And what I mean by conservative, I mean those who see the Bible as God's word and what it affirms and it teaches, their personal conversion and their seriousness in their apprenticeship to Jesus. Ironically, they're even more charitable to secular causes than are secular people. And this goes beyond monetary charitable giving even to things like giving of blood. And so you have the Syracuse professor, now at Harvard, who writes the book, Who Really Cares? America's Charitable Divide, Who Gives, Who Doesn't, and Why It Matters, Arthur Brooks. He was, by his own account, liberal, and he said, I had to go through the data again and again and again. And this data was not just in America, in the United States, it was in Canada, it was in Europe, across the board. He said, in years of research, after 40 years, I have never found a measurable way in which secularists are more charitable than religious people. That is profound, because the common charge is that Christians are oppressive, they're hateful, they're harmful. They're not really helping out people. He goes on and says religious people were 25 percentage points more likely to give than secularists. Religious people were also 23 points more likely to volunteer. Religious people who, per family, earned exactly the same amount as secularists, say $49,000, gave about 3.5 times more money per year. They also volunteered more than twice as often. He says people who pray every day are 30 percentage points more likely to give money to charity than people who never pray. The churchgoer will be 9 points more likely than the secularist to give to non-religious charities. So it's not just, they give tithe. 25 points more likely to volunteer for secular causes. And he goes on to even talk about the mentality and say, when you take this divide and take people who have a strong view of government with respect to its responsibility to the poor, versus those who are more skeptical to government and its role with respect to the poor, he says you can predict, not absolutely, but generally, that person who holds a big government view versus a skeptical government view will invariably give less personally to charity. Big Brother's going to take care of it. It's not my responsibility. Well then, what about human rights? The Holocaust in World War II, we start thinking a lot about human rights. The attempted genocide of the Jewish people provided a major impetus for the human rights movement. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, we see that humans have a special moral status in that document. It demands, quote, the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. The grounding of this intrinsic dignity is universally shared by humans in virtue of their being human as such. It is because such rights are owed to human dignity that it's inherent and that they are likewise inalienable. One of the architects of the UDHR is Harvard-trained philosopher and UN Secretary General Charles Malik, a devout Christian who did his PhD at Harvard in philosophy and earned, apparently, 50 plus honorary doctorates, more than anyone else in the world. It's this notion of inalienable rights that we find in the U.S. Declaration of Independence 2 centuries prior. Recently, Tim Kaine, senator of Virginia and former governor and former presidential candidate, was absolutely shocked. He said that, I can't believe people think that rights come from God. This is like Iran, like the Iranian Islamic regime. He's in Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson was at. The Declaration of Independence, hello? The state cannot take away what it had no authority to grant. It is something transcendentally endowed by our Creator. It is why all lives matter. Black, brown, white, yellow, red, polka dot, striped, everything imaginable. And none of whose lives matter if there isn't a metaphysical grounding for why these lives matter. Legality ought not determine morality, rather morality ought to determine legality. The modern expression of human rights didn't emerge in a vacuum. Like capitalism, it has deeper historical roots deriving historically. Originally from natural rights, John Locke, and before that it evolved from natural law, Thomas Aquinas and others, and before that from eternal law. Now, few documents have provided as much platform for freedom and human flourishing as the U.S. Constitution, and not by accident, it gives pride of place to the Bill of Rights, right to the first one, and that is the freedom of religion, and freedom even from religion, right? Backed up by the Second Amendment for interesting reasons. But John Quincy Adams was alleged to have said that the highest glory of the American Revolution was that it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of Christianity and the principles of civil government. Our constitutional Republican form of liberal democracy was designed to preserve rather than curtail human freedom, given the Christian insights into human persons. We're not just molecules bouncing back and forth. We're souls that have bodies, capable of libertarian freedom. The seed of the self-destruction, even of slavery, was embedded in thought, even though it would take another century. It was Christians in England with Wilberforce and others, and then in the USA, who were the first in history to oppose slavery at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Only 10 years ago, one country in Africa finally outlawed it. It's been practiced forever since the beginning of time. It was Christians that put a stop to it. Sparsely is there a nation or people considered to have been more free, prosperous, and charitable than America due to its founders recognizing inalien human rights. This is not to argue that America is necessarily a Christian nation. It's not found in the Declaration of Independence, the term Christ. It's not found in our Constitution. It is found in most of the state charters. But at the same time, let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't founded by pantheists, where all is mind and there is no matter, because you have a separation between endowed by our Creator and creations. All is not one. It wasn't founded by materialists. You have endowed by our Creator. And it wasn't found by Muslim theists. There weren't many around. And Jewish theists, there were some. And even the deists, which is a form of theism, were few by comparison to the number of Christians. So while we might not say, according to the key documents, that this is a Christian nation, it quite obviously is a Christian-inspired nation. Where else is the inspiration coming from? James Griffin, in his book On Human Rights, says that the French marked off the secularization of the concept by changing the name from natural rights to human rights. The secularized notion that we were left with at the end of the Enlightenment is still our notion today. Its intention has not changed since then, a right that we have simply in virtue of being human. Now, Charles Darwin, in his Descent of Man, went on to say, if men were reared under the precise same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. I'm sort of morbid. Sometimes I watch YouTube videos late at night on prey and predators, and I've seen a lot of lions in the Serengeti. And when young male lions arise and take their prime, it's time to take over a pride. And they go after an older lion, and they rip it to pieces, and sometimes just leave it there for dead, and then they will rip off its testicles just to humiliate it. And then they'll do the next thing. They go off and they see their harem, their polygamous harem, and they say, wait here, we'll be right back. Where are your children? And they go after the little lion cubs, and they wipe them out. Now, according to Darwin, how many of you come from step families now? Think about this. The stepdad would come in, and he wants to spread his own seed. And so he's just going to wipe you out. Really? And we don't think about this and take this for granted. James Rachels, whose text I would use, I assigned it, he's an atheist author, for 12 years at Indiana University. He says in this book, Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism, we are not entitled, not on evolutionary grounds at any rate, to regard our own adaptive behavior as better or higher than that of a cockroach, who, after all, is adapted equally well to life. And Steven Pinker, in his book, How the Mind Works, says our brains were developed for fitness, not for truth. Now, this is important. Think about this, not just for ethics, but for epistemology, theories of knowledge, right? In philosophy, you have metaphysics, what is real, epistemology, how do I know what is real, and then ethics, how should I then live based on what I know about reality? That's philosophy. That's PH in a nutshell to all of your PhD professors, even to those who have never taken a philosophy class in their lives. They're all philosophers. They're all armchairing philosophy, being experts at the D and sometimes not even realizing the PH. Now think about this here. If I evolved purely naturalistically, so we're not talking about theistic evolution or anything like that, naturalistic evolution, if I evolved, then my body evolved. If my body evolved, then my brain evolved. If my brain evolved, my logic and reasoning processes evolved. How do I know they evolved correctly, and how do I know I'm having this conversation with you right now? I don't. For all I know, I'm a brain in a vat plugged with electrodes by some super scientist, and it's just giving me this a sense of a virtual reality, which is to say, not reality. You've ever woken up sometime and you had that dream and you're like, oh my gosh, did I really do that to that person? Or did that person do that to me? I'm going to call them, tell them off today. And then you have to cool down for about 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes and think, was that a dream or was that reality? Have you had those real dreams before? Where you can't distinguish between the dream state and the waking state? How do you know you're not in a dream state right now? Right? You don't. Now, when I go on the Serengeti, you all know this little story that you see a bear coming or a lion coming. You don't have to be the fastest runner. You just have to be faster than the other guy with you, right? Well, there are other things. Let's take perceptual knowledge, for example. Let's say I'm a person who suffers from color blindness. I found that out when I went to the Army MEPS station, and they told me I was colorblind, and I realized I'd been victimized my entire life until now. I never knew. And sat down, bummed out, went like this. My pant legs came up, and I had a light sock on and a blue sock. It runs higher among males than females. For all you know, guys, you might just be colorblind. But let's take perceptual problems. Let's say you have a depth perception with respect to your perceptions. And we go out on the Serengeti together, and we see this lion. And Marcus has got proper depth perception. He sees this lion 200 yards out. I see it, and it looks like it's 20 yards out. Who is going to be the first one to flight for survival? Me. Which is to say that nature can select for or preserve traits that lead to survival adaptivity, and if enough cases like that happened, the Marcuses of the world get wiped out, right? You don't need to have proper depth perception. You don't need to have understanding of the abstract laws of logic or algebraic equations to be the toughest hombre on the Serengeti. You just need to be the strongest to survive. And so here's the thing. One of my friends, one of our chapter directors at University of Nebraska, where I was lecturing last month, led a biology professor there to Christ who is an atheistic evolutionist. And he said, look, suppose evolution's true, suppose naturalism's true. If they're both true, you're screwed. If evolution's true, you need to be a theist. Because if evolution and naturalism are true, together, those have this toxicity that you have an intrinsic defeater. Because how do I know that my cognitive processes have evolved? Because the purpose to my cognitive processes is not for truth, but survival. And yet Harvard was founded on veritas, truth. Yale went down the road and said, lux et veritas, light and truth. Princeton said, de sub numine viget, under God she flourishes. And the universities were about the pursuit of truth. How do we know truth even is real? How do I even get to it, and why does it even matter? And so Dawkins, in his most recent book, Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, said, irrational or not, it does unfortunately seem plausible that if somebody sincerely believes God is watching his every move, he might be more likely to be good. So Dawkins now thinks that Christians are actually good, right? Especially in light of the comparative worldview where he's at now. Well, isn't that interesting? I always love a good group photo. Jeffrey Epstein right there with Richard, right there with Lawrence Krauss, who Epstein gave $250,000, and right there with Steven Pinker of Enlightenment now at Harvard. I love a good group photo. And there's Dan Dennett right there with a nice lady on his lap. I love a group photo. I'm not making any accusations here. I'm just saying, friends. Friends. The reason why we have a problem with Epstein is because of Christianity. You are living on the borrowed capital of a Christian worldview if you disagree with that. If naturalism is true and evolution is true, you couldn't even know that naturalism or evolution are true, much less having sex with 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds. How do you know? How can you be confident in your knowledge if your noetic equipment is aimed at survival and not truth? And I know there are realist moral philosophers, not like Peter Singer, that believe that there are moral absolutes, but they're harder to come by. And that's why Singer, the most famous moral philosopher alive, he has cockeyed ideas like, so long as it's mutually consensual and there's no harm inflicted on the animal, it's still February. Why not have a late Valentine's night on the farm? I'm not kidding. Look at his article, Dearest Pet. So long as it's mutually consensual and there's no harm inflicted on the animal, and if you say, that's gross, how could you, he's going to say, you're discrimination. You're a discriminating person. What do you mean? You're committing the view against speciesism, a form of discrimination, because you're exalting the human species as a special species. Dostoevsky said, if God is dead, everything's permissible. I'm going to end here, but we could go on, as my newest book does, and I've been to all the the colonial schools. I've written about them all. I was at Jonathan Edwards' grave the other day. I don't talk to the dead, I'm kidding, but I was there, Witherspoon. I know the history behind these schools. And for the first 200 years, every college president virtually in America was also a member of the clergy and would give the chief capstone class in moral philosophy during the student's senior year to help them understand what it means to be a good person, a good citizen, and then give the commencement address to go out and change the world. For the first 200 years, up until 1880, church and chapel attendance were still required. Big long story about how this happened, how the universities got taken over, and how we came to think that, the bright people, the brights are really the atheists and the agnostics. The Christians, they just believe by faith. No, there's a long story, I get into it in my book, of how the universities were taken over and how we've gone through now, we're in the second ideological revolution. But rationality and the rise of the universities, just like morality and education and hospitality and things that we just talked about, are grounded comfortably with more finesse in the Christian worldview. We begin with a world of mind, a worldview of mind, and not a worldview of matter. John's gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and became flesh and dwelt among us. In the Greek, NRK and ha logos. In the beginning was the logic, and the logic was with God and was God. The laws of logic themselves, upon which all science depend, are invariable abstract entities that you can't smell, taste, touch, hear, or feel. What other things in the world exist immaterially that you can know with such confidence? You can't know anything in science with certainty, and there are certain things that you can never know with science. And then if we look at even at the sciences, all the founders of the subdisciplines of the sciences were Christians. From Mendel playing with his pea pods in his monastery, coming up with genotype and phenotype traits, to Copernicus, to Newton, Galileo, to Maxwell, Einstein, where I was just at, in his 1925 paper, was dragged kicking and screaming to a temporal universe. On and on it goes. The father of modern science, Francis Bacon, spoke about the two books of God, God's work and God's word, Scripture and nature. I think he got it from Augustine. But he says there can't be any contradiction at the level of the facts themselves. Contradictions will only come at the level of the interpretation or explanation of the facts, be it theology or science, which are models, interpretations, abstractions. The facts, if we've got good independent reasons for thinking that God exists and that the Bible is God's word, are not going to contradict at the end of the day. And this is why it was Christians who started the universities and the hospitals, because we begin with the logic of God incarnate. And Jesus said that the purpose of life is to know God. Christianity is not a faith tradition. It is a knowledge tradition. What we have is knowledge. And it's pretense and hubris to think that Christians are blind faith believers when we are the ones historically that started all of these great institutions. I could say a whole lot more if we get into it, but I'm going to go on. I'm going to end with Tom Holland here. Tom Holland is a Roman and Greek historian. Like Richard Dawkins, who now wants to call himself a cultural Christian, and Elon Musk wants to call himself a cultural Christian, and Jordan Peterson, an existentialist Christian, and you've got all these people now that want Dawkins, cultural Christian. He's, I love the church bells, right? He loves the fruit of Christendom, but he thinks he can get it from the supermarket, these beautiful, juicy apples from the supermarket indefinitely. Sorry, Dr. Dawkins, those fruits come from a root, and you can't have it apart from the root. Tom Holland says in his book Dominion, and he calls himself an agnostic Christian, how the Christian Revolution remade the world. That every human being possessed an equal dignity was not remotely self-evident a truth. The Romans would have laughed at it. The origins of this principle, as Nietzsche had so contemptuously pointed out, lay not in the French Revolution, nor in the Declaration of Independence, nor in the Enlightenment, Steven Pinker, but in the Bible. And he goes on to say why I was wrong about Christianity. The founding conviction of the Enlightenment, that it owed nothing to the faith into which its greatest figures had been born, increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable. Even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. From education to rationality, and rationality to compassion and morality, we observe constituent goods of human flourishing, most prominently displayed in civilization, due to the fruitful product of the logic of God incarnate. And St. Anselm, who gave us the ontological argument, I noticed that one of the great logicians, Kurt Gödel, is buried over here, I think, in the seminary, in the cemetery. Anselm gave us the ontological argument. Gödel affirmed the ontological argument. He said he paid the debt he did not owe because we owed a debt we could not pay. And that's why the movement has been so powerful. Questions?
Yes, I'm curious. So you've made the case that Christianity is good for society. I think at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about the world today, so society right now.
Right.
What I'm curious about is what you project going forward, because it's undeniably the case that Christianity is on the decline, has been on the decline for a long time. And I don't know if there's reason to think that that's going to change. And so
Yeah.
What do you think about that, and what do you think it means for society, for the West, for the United States?
Well, I think that, first of all, if Christianity is on the decline now in the West, as it clearly seems to be, what do we think about that going forward, and what does that have to do with the future of civilization? First of all, it is not in decline in the world. There are more Christians in communist China than there are members of the Communist Party. It may well be the way of how things go that Europe becomes Islamic either because of immigration or birth, and that America becomes like Europe recently was, and that China becomes, or the East becomes, the heart of the Christian church. Africa, no doubt, is growing by leaps and bounds, and they're some of the only ones that aren't having a birth problem, right? In Japan, it's one generation away, and that population will be 50% of what it is today. In South Korea. In Japan, it's 2 generations. In America, we're only 3 generations away, and the American population will be halved. In Africa, that's not a problem. The church is growing in the global South and in the East. Now, in the West, right, it seems to be declining, but that decline has stopped. That decline has stopped. The rise of the nuns has capped. And I think the rise of the new atheist with Richard Dawkins and others beginning in 2001 coming to an absolute halt, and Dawkins now getting thrown off of his throne, sort of like the Robespierre of the French Revolution. He tried to create the guillotine and guillotine, all religion. And now he's been guillotined by his own guillotine as the American Humanist Society stripped him of his Humanist of the Year award that they gave him 25 years ago. People are reconsidering, even Dawkins, even to use that expression, I'm now a cultural Christian. He said, when it comes to Islamism or Marxism, I'm on Team Christian every day. I think what's been happening over the last 5 or 10 years in this cultural revolution that we are in the West, and specifically here in America, it's no longer abstract. You can see what a culture will look like if a new worldview does come in and sweep. What Peter Boghossian, the atheist who wrote the manual for creating atheists, and he and I went on lecture tour to universities together. He said that Richard and I and we were talking about viewpoint diversity, the death of intellectual diversity in the universities, because the universities are not places of viewpoint diversity. They are absolutely not. The Ivy Leagues are almost all 90+%. The faculty give campaign contributions to one political party. This is a monopoly. It has changed from being a place of viewpoint diversity. And he says that Richard and Daniel Dennett and Michael Shermer and I, we all talked amongst ourselves, and we knew that if we destroyed God or the gods in the West, that something else, worse perhaps, may come along, and none of us realized how bad it would become. And then he told me one day after I lectured in his atheism seminar on God's existence, we went out to lunch after, and he said, look, I'm done with the atheism-theism debate. It's over. We're in a cultural revolution in the West, and how it ends, we don't know. But no, I don't think that Christianity as a global affair is on the decline. I think the West has been, and I think that has stopped. Whether it's growing or not, that's another question. But I think it's stopped. Another question?
Yes. Christianity, particularly the image of Christ, were to decline, things start changing. Not just culturally, but the way we take our own history, the way we think about our values, so on and so forth. And my question is, to hypothesize, to guess, what do you think might happen if society decided to go on some Kantian moralistic route, where all of a sudden we start trying to take some of the values of Christ or some of the values of the faith and just export those from their association with God? To suddenly say, yes, we can have the values, but we can create our own moral standard. And in doing so, we don't need Christ, we don't need religious institution. Where do you think that would take us societally?
What we want is the inference to the best explanation, for one thing, right? We have evidence, we have data, and then we have interpretation, and we have explanation, and those are not the same thing. I think while there are, despite the fact that most atheists academic moral philosophers. The large A of the report here for moral philosophy is that most of them are utilitarians of one version or another. The greatest good for the greatest number. Peter Singer was a preference utilitarian. But there are Kantians, there are Platonists, there are, other sorts of normative ethical systems that non-Christian philosophers will adopt, right? But I don't think they're the best. And let me kind of give you a reason for thinking so. Kant, who wrote ethics within the bounds or within the limits of reason, apart from religion. And Thomas Jefferson, who kind of gets influenced by it as a deist, comes along and it takes an X-Acto blade to all the miracles of the New Testament. That was sort of Immanuel Kant, right? Anti-miracles and so forth. So naturalizing even Christian religion, if you will. I don't think you can carve that out because remember when I talked about philosophy, the PH behind every D of every professor you have. You don't begin up here. Applied philosophy, and Singer was a great applied philosopher. That's the tip of the iceberg, gun control, sexuality, economics, things like that, war. Now that's the tip of the iceberg. Normative ethics is the thicker part, even of ethics, and it wasn't the tip of the iceberg that sank the Titanic. It's grounded in epistemology, theories of knowledge, which is deeper and even further into metaphysics and metaethics. So when Plato asked the question, why should I be moral? The Kantian could ask, why should we be moral? But he can't really ask too well, why should I be moral, like Plato asked, right? I'm here in Princeton in New Jersey. I live back in Indiana. What my wife doesn't know won't hurt her, so I take off my ring, go out, have a good time. I get home and I kiss my kids goodnight and my wife goodnight. A happy wife is a happy life, the best of all worlds. Why should I not pursue the virtue of selfishness? Ayn Rand. Why should I not do that? Plato's idea of the Ring of Gyges in the Republic is where J.R.R. Tolkien got the idea for the Lord of the Rings. If I had this ring and it had the power of invisibility, and I knew I could get away and I could not get caught if I did my homework correctly, why should I be moral? What would you do, Plato asked, if you had the power of invisibility? And I think all of us, if you were honest, you may do some good and some bad. That Chase Bank down the road has a little too much money, capitalist dogs. I deserve some of that. I need some of that. That girl that I saw in class the other day that I fantasized about, that person who cut me off on the side of the road earlier, I got his license plate. If you had the power to not get caught, what things might you do? And I think if we're all honest, we would do some pretty wicked things. And we might do some good things too. Plato said at the end of the day, people are either good, they're good for either one of two reasons. Out of fear of getting caught, you slow down when you see the sirens behind you, and not otherwise. Out of fear of getting caught, fear of paying for the consequences, fear of being shunned by the herd or the group, or for the love of the good, because it's just the right thing to do. That's what the virtuous person would do. What would Aristotle do? What would Jesus do? What would the virtuous person do? And for a Christian, as Dawkins now admits, we believe what he calls the divine spy camera theory. Someone else is watching. Even if no one else is, why can a Christian be a good citizen? Justin Martyr argued to the emperor. Because we give an account to God, right? Now, in none of the other world religions are you finding a judgment in an afterlife like this, where you've got a robust view of God like the one that the Christian has, where God is intrinsically virtuous, and out of that flows his divine will, what he wills, his commands, which are consistent with his moral nature. That's a distinction between Allah as well and the Christian view of God. Now, the Christian view of God, if I can draw concentric circles here, in ethics, we think about things like this. You have at the very superficial level precepts. And then you have moral principles, which are deeper. And then you have person, right? And so out here at the superficial level, you have things like the speed limit. 45 miles an hour, 75 miles an hour, 65 miles. They seem kind of relative. They're not at the end of the day. You know, when you're in the neighborhood and you see a bunch of freshmen walking by, you better slow down because it's like being next to a bunch of kindergartners, right? Right? You hit them. That's what happens on Purdue's campus anyway. They're just not paying attention. The reason why it's 25 miles an hour rather than 24 or 26 might seem arbitrary, but it's because these little human things are walking around, not rats. If you're a 16-year-old boy, you're thinking, roadkill, 10 points, right? Unless you're Peter Singer at 16. But because these little human things are walking around who are made in God's image, you slow down to 25 miles an hour. You are invoking a moral principle behind the law, the superficial law you have there, and having different speed limits, different here and there, but for good rhyme and reason at the end of the day, right? Well, this is going to shock you, but murder is sort of like one of those superficial ones, right? In a way, we say, don't murder. Why not? Because it's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? Because it's not right. Why isn't it right? Because it's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it's not right. And eventually, you've all done this, and your parents at home say, because I'm the dad and you're the kid, and that's that. So if we stopped right there at the precept level, it's legalism, it's authoritarianism, right? But we want to go deeper than that, and we want to say, well, why should I not murder? Because it violates the principle of the sanctity of human life. Now, if you're not a Christian, or someone who believes in Genesis 1:26, you're not going to be able to say, thou shalt not murder. You're only going to be able to say, don't murder. And it doesn't quite carry the same kind of weight to motivate you, but even then, don't murder is the moral principle. Murder is a violation of the value of human life, we call it, which is still deeper than the precept superficial level. When you get to the principles, it's deeper, right? Now, the atheist, if he's a Platonist, can stop here because Plato believed, like Aristotle and Socrates, they were monotheists. They were not polytheists like the Greek religions. They were monotheists, and they believed in God, and they believed in moral absolutes or objective moral features to the world. But Plato said that God's existence wasn't necessary for morality because, like the world of forms and other things, there are absolutes that exist outside of God, morality being a set of those things, right? And so you can be an atheist Platonist. Plato was a theistic Platonist, but you can get rid of that, as you've been suggesting, and be an atheist Platonist. And now here's the problem. You're stuck at the principle level. Suppose there are these principles out there, like the golden rule, just floating around somewhere in metaphysical space, whatever that means, or the principle of justice, just floating around out there in metaphysical space. I don't even know what that means. But suppose that's the case. If I'm a materialist, I can't taste justice. I can't. Everyone just try. Stick your tongue out and taste. What does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? It's nonsense perceptible. Moral facts are like mathematical facts or like logical facts. You can't taste them, touch them, smell them, feel them, or hear them. If I'm a materialist, I've got a hard problem there. But here's the thing. Moral properties are such that they are connected to persons. I don't owe something to this screen or this microphone or this water. I owe something to you and you to me, such that moral facts are always connected to persons. And so the Christian has a deeper, greater explanatory scope and power of where these moral principles derive. They come from person. Don't murder. Why? Because it violates the sanctity of human life. Why? Because God is life. Don't lie. Why? Because it violates the universal principle of truth-telling or the virtue of honesty. Why does that matter? Because God is truth. At the end of the day, in the Christian worldview, we've not only got a deeper explanation that resonates with the nature of morality at the meta-ethical level, we've got a greater motivation for moral obligation as well. So we have a richer explanatory and motivational system than any of these other things because it's grounded in God. And ultimately, God in Christ is who we are so motivated to follow. The biggest movement in human history, secular or religious. And we say, what would Jesus do? So I say to Richard Dawkins, you can't be buying these beautiful cultural Christian fruits at the grocery store forever. You're going to run out eventually. You can't have the fruit without the root. Good luck in trying, but that's why we're in the cultural mess we're in. Last question, final question.
Since we need Christianity in America and the rest of the West, how can we bring back Christendom in America, and how can ecumenism, unity within all Christian denominations, play a big part to achieve this?
That's a great question. I answer that in my book, buy my book. No, but seriously, I think if we look at the problem we're in now, this is no longer grandma's America. This country is in a revolution right now. I say look no further than the universities. As go the universities, so goes the culture. As goes the U.S. universities, so goes the world. We started the universities, and I lay out how the first ideological revolution happened. That we didn't have PhD programs here. We had to send our best and brightest overseas to Germany mostly, where they were the most formally educated country in the history of the world. And look what they did. Just because you have a formal education doesn't mean it's wise and doesn't mean it's good. But, that's where Kant was at, and Schleiermacher, and Nietzsche, and Freud, and Marx, and so many other people. And then they came over to Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, and so forth. And they took over our universities from 1880 to 1930. The dust was settling. Right in the 1930s, something nefarious was happening again in Germany. This little Frankfurt school of critical theory, critical gender theory, race theory, pedagogy, queer theory, et cetera, et cetera. Marxism plus whatever other topic it's talking about. And through that, and Antonio Gramsci down south, whose views got mediated into the English-speaking world through a Marxist professor at Notre Dame named Joseph Buttigieg, father of Mayor Pete. We're talking cultural Marxism. And then 15 years later, postmodernism started. And you've got Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard. Every one of them were card-carrying members of the French Communist Party or sympathizers with it. All of them came over in this witch's brew of postmodern cultural Marxist thought, populated our top universities for decades, got stopped a little bit at the race level during the 60s because MLK had a dream and said, be colorblind, don't be concerned about the color of my skin, be concerned with the content of my character. Sexuality pressed forward, but then they realized, okay, we're not going to get away with blowing up banks and government buildings like we would in 2020s, but what we need to do is the workers of the world unite. No longer can be coming off the factory floors. They need to come from the academic elite. And so they said, just like Mao taught us, we need to talk about the long march through the institutions. And they spelled it out into academia, media, and into ecclesia. In the West, you can't have a revolution like you could in the East, like in Russia and China, because there was like this thing that's sort of like a living cell that keeps, like a castle that keeps propping itself up. Every time you lodge shells at it, it self-regenerates. And what are you going to do? There's this soft tissue of culture, a soft revolution. Well, you need to ensconce yourselves into the soft institutional tissues of academia, media, and ecclesia. And once you're sufficiently ensconced, then the political society will fall like dominoes, which includes military and government and law enforcement. And that's what's been going on, and that explains why, remember, politics is superficial. That's downstream from culture from education, and the apex of education is the university. It's why you now have in politics people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, a Kennedy, who are now and recent presidential candidates who are now serving in the Republican cabinet. Why you have people, lifelong Democrats like Elon Musk, who's now all in as a Republican, and Bruce Jenner, AKA Caitlyn Jenner, who ran for the Republican governor position backed by the RNC, and Richard Dawkins now. All this crazy, there's a revolution happening. And so there is this new alliance forming in political alliances between atheists and Christians even, because some foreign ideology that's not conservative or liberal, it's illiberal, it's the new left, not the old left, it's the Marxist left, has infiltrated all the flora and fauna of culture. And so what we can say is that the university has had two ideological revolutions since the time that the Christians founded it and kept it for the first 2.5 centuries. And if it can happen not just once but twice, it can happen a third time. And that's what my new book calls for, is a third revolution infiltrating into academia, like storming the beaches of Normandy. And I'm not saying pitchforks and torches. I'm talking about a brain to brain, a mind to mind. Debate is not hate. Allow us the free opportunity to get Christians into these places, and we will come out victorious on the top because we have the truth and we can demonstrate that. So what we need to do is learn a clue from the Marxists on how they infiltrated institutions. And we need, as Christians, to be practicing institutional recapture. It's not enough simply that changed lives change culture. James Davison Hunter, sociology professor from the University of Virginia, wrote the book To Change the World. And he said these things sometimes may get started at the grassroots, but they never get traction unless they are baptized by the elite, by the institutions. And so the first Revolutionary Guard is now being pushed out. The second is in its ascendancy. We need to be, as Christians, and if you're not a Christian here, I hope what you realize here is I'm not talking about some violent or taking back a Christian national, whatever that even means. I'm talking about just give us equal airtime. We started these institutions, and now somehow we're told don't even come in, give us your tuition money and your kids, but keep your ideas out. That's not viewpoint diversity. That's not free thinking. We need to capitalize on that, and we need to find allies within academia who don't even share our Christian view, who value that kind of thing. So when Peter Boghossian and I went on tour together and we were talking about viewpoint diversity, the death of intellectual diversity in the universities, we cited Voltaire, the deist, as a neutral playing point, who quipped, I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. Stalin says something by contrast, ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons, so why should we let them have ideas? That's the source of cancel culture, and it's predominantly on the left. And it's not necessarily the old left, it's the new left, the Marxist left. So I think what we need to show, and I lay this out in my book because the greatest objection right now is Christianity is not good for the world. We need to be able to show that Christianity is good for the world, that it is reasonable, and that it is true. And we need to debate these things and generate more light than heat in the way that we do it. But then we need to rethink where we have been at with our churches who are so enamored in skinny jeans and fog machines in their Sunday morning services, and they're guided more by sociology and culture now than theology and scripture. Jonathan Edwards would turn over in his grave, I know because I talked to him yesterday over there in the grave. He was the president of Princeton. He was America's greatest theologian. He was a metaphysician too. It's not the case, as Bertrand Russell says, that the average Christian would rather die than think. In fact, they do. That might be true of this century of Christians in America. That is not true of the first 1900 years. Remember, Christians started the universities. Steven Pinker and others now are waxing eloquent from our institutions and sawing off the very branch that they sit on. As someone once said, even of Europe needs to reinvest right now and reconsider Christianity. Secularism has no staying power. It doesn't build anything. It's a parasite on existing systems and ideas. Thank you. Time to go out and create snowmen, I guess.